Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. Actually, I did. I just couldn't come up with a better intro. Anyways, hello guys, gals and gamers, and welcome back to another video. Today, we're going to be talking about Pokemon Sword and Shield. I know, it's kind of weird. Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are just coming, and you want to talk about the previous Pokemon games. Why? Well, I actually want to talk about the legacy of Pokemon Sword and Shield, and I think this is a very interesting discussion to have because we are right at the end of this generation, and starting from Pokemon Sword and Shield, this whole generation has been very divisive and controversial. So I think it is very interesting to have a little discussion on where will Pokemon Sword and Shield be in kind of the universal ranking of all Pokemon games in, say, 10 years or so. I think the best place to, start really talking about this is just going full frontal and addressing the Copperaja or Donphan in the room. And that is, of course, all of the controversy that Pokemon Sword and Shield had. Now, the main core of this controversy came from, I think it was E3 2019. They had like a interview with Game Freak developers, and then they just casually said that not all Pokemon will be in this game for good. Not at all will be coded into the game. You will not have all Pokemon ever made in this game. And that was a weirdly casual announcement that just took a lot of people off guard, and I do not blame them. Up to this point, aside from, I think, the third generation of Pokemon games, Pokemon fans were used to having all 8 billion Pokemon in one game at all times, so this was a bit of a shock. And that's kind of started the whole controversy, and then it rolled over from there to something much worse, and there was a lot of hate campaigns against Freak and a lot of trash talking about the developers online. It was just people being angry and not understanding how game development really works, and it was kind of a shitty time to be a Pokemon fan. And things got even worse when the Pokemon games came out, Sword and Shield, and then there were a couple of mistranslated interviews and people not really understanding where Game Freak was coming from, and things got even worse. A lot of people started noticing some weird things going on in the wild area, for example, not everything looking up to date. Some cutscenes in the game that definitely would have required voice acting. So this just made Pokemon games and Game Freak look kind of outdated and awkward. And of course, some of this is due to Game Freak having a very tight schedule and not being able to produce the game of all Pokemon fans' dreams in just a couple of years. People were very hyped in the beginning of Sword and Shield announcement cycle because this was the first console Pokemon game, but what they got probably didn't excite many people in that way because it was a lot more expensive, and they were expecting something like the Final Fantasy VII remake about Pokemon or something like that. They were just expecting like a bit too much from the games, and what they got was a new Pokemon game. And Game Freak has never been in the forefront of technological innovation when it comes to Pokemon games, and that's just how they are, and that's the best they can be. But yeah, there was a lot of controversy, people talking about animations and blah, 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 all of this. Just dumb talk. But this clearly did taint some of the perspective people had on Pokemon Sword and Shield. While it is a good game, I really do like it. This is definitely one of the major events of this generation, was this entire controversy behind the games. But going more in depth about what was actually in the games, I think a good place to start is the Pokemon themselves, the Pokemon designs. And this generation, at least to me, felt a bit lacking. There were some great designs. I love Indeedee, I love the Impidimp Lime, I love Applin, Dracovish is also really cool. The fossils in general had like this cool gimmick, but maybe a bit too many of the fossils. Maybe that's just my taste. But what this generation I feel like was missing was that one big Pokemon that really captured the audience. Something like a Lucario or a Gardevoir or a Greninja, something that becomes an instant fan favorite. And that was kind of missing in this generation, and that is a bit of a shame. There were certainly popular Pokemon. I think a lot of people like Cinderace, but other Pokemon like the legendaries, some people like Zacian, but other people also really hate Zacian because it's just way too powerful in the competitive. Eternatus, I don't see many people caring about at all. Zamazenta, same thing. Zarude. He also exists. I just remembered before recording this video that he indeed exists. And also, something like Mega Evolutions, which Generation 6 had, were beloved, and a lot of them had really cool designs. I don't think the same applies for Dynamax and Dynamax form, or Gigantamax forms, that is. Not so solid designs over there, and I don't think the mechanic itself is so beloved. So I don't think they did very well in this generation. They did okay, but Pokemon usually has like very top tier creature designs, so I was a little bit disappointed. And just in general, from my own perspective, I don't see that much like fan art or fan celebrating a certain Pokemon from the 8th generation. There are a few ones that people kind of like, but not many that people really are into. Like I said, something like a Lucario or a Gardevoir or something else like that that really captures people's attention with the design. So that was a bit disappointing. Another unfortunately disappointing part of Pokemon Sword and Shield was the story. And the story, I just don't even remember what happened in the story. It was something about the darkest day, you know, Eternatus reviving itself or coming from sleep, and the company president was the obvious bad guy, and blah blah blah. There were some points in the story where it just felt like they just made things up. Like you find a historic relic or some historic text from like a fast food restaurant, and then there was this point in the game where there were giant Pokemon, Gigantamax Pokemon fighting, and that was never shown to the player. This, plus what I mentioned before, not having voice acting and having several cutscenes that definitely would have benefited from voice acting, makes the overall story feel a bit awkward and not very well thought out. I think that it had some really interesting themes in it, but it just didn't capture it as well as something like Generation 5 did. I think it was about climate change and kind of preparing for something, and then President Rose taking it way too far with way too catastrophic results, and I think you could have made something interesting out of there. But where I think Sword and Shield do excel a bit more than some other games is the characters. I see a lot of people like characters like Leon or Sonia or Nessa from the games, and this, for me, is especially wonderful because usually the characters have the anime to support them. But in this case, of course, Leon and Sonia are in the anime, but a lot of the characters just are not that much. And that was definitely a big part on delivering all of these characters to the players, because some of the time these characters don't really have a personality. I mean, think about it. Do you like Brock or Misty from Pokemon. Do you like them because of the games or the anime? If you have just played the games, do they really stand out? Not that much. So anime usually does a good job of portraying these characters, the players, and really giving them a personality, which unfortunately is something the games do not often. But this time, the anime was not tied to one region, but was mostly about Ash and his boyfriend traveling around many different regions, including the new one. But the new one wasn't that big of a highlight there. So I think that will have a negative effect on how people remember the characters going forward. And also, I think Serena from Pokemon X and Y is another good example of a character that doesn't really have a personality, but people love her because of the anime. I mean, when was the last time someone talked about the male character of Pokemon X and Y? Never, because it's not memorable. But because of the anime, people love Serena. Another thing that was really interesting about this generation was the region itself. And the region, the Galar region, was of course based on the UK. I think the games did a very wonderful job of like representing the culture and the people that actually do live in the UK. Thankfully, no monarchy there, so Pokemon games still have some credibility. But overall, like, it was really cool. And as someone who has spent a lot of time traveling around the UK, I definitely did notice some like similarities on how people speak, how some things are portrayed, and that was just wonderful to me. And I have a couple of friends also in the UK that really enjoyed this game because they were set in a UK-like region. Another thing that was really cool about the region is, of course, the main big thing about these games, and that is, of course, the wild area, which was Game Freak really trying for the first time on doing an open world game. Now, for the main game, the base game, the wild area that we had wasn't that great. It was a bit weird. There were some weird visual design things that I didn't agree with, like how the weather keeps changing and the pop-up wasn't great. But when the DLC launched, I think the wild areas got a lot better and there was more to explore and more cool Pokemon to find, and the roaming Pokemon that came in the Pokemon Crown Tundra DLC were a cool new twist on a previous mechanic that I was really glad to see. So I think the region itself was pretty cool. From the other routes that were not a part of the wild area, I don't really remember much of them, and I had really no like incentive to revisit them after I had beaten the game. So that was a bit of a shame. It is something that happens in Pokemon games from time to time, especially when you don't have like a roaming Pokemon or you're not given an item like the Poke Radar that allows you to find new Pokemon in similar routes or the routes that you have already been to after the game. So it was a bit of a shame that there was really no reason to revisit some of the routes. But at the same time, a lot of them look beautiful. One clear standout, I think, was like Glimwood Tangle, the Enchanted Forest. That was one of the most beautiful looking towns in RPGs I have played ever. And it's really funny when people say that Pokemon Sword and Shield look really ugly, because from some parts it kind of does look a bit awkward, but at the same time, Glimwood Tangle exists, so Game Freak clearly can make beautiful looking towns. And I think that is about it from what I have to say. But here is kind of the conclusion. And I think Pokemon Sword and Shield will kind of be seen as kind of a mid-generation. It was okay. Some people will of course like it, and I think that will be a lot of people because Pokemon Sword and Shield sold really well. And a lot of this just has to do kind of with how the future plans out. We already know a few games that came after Pokemon Sword and Shield, and one of them, Pokemon Brilliant Diamond Shining Pearl, I feel like were even more kind of disliked by the Pokemon community. So I don't think people will see Pokemon Sword and Shield as that bad of a game in the future. But we don't know how the next main big generation games will plan out. That is, of course, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. If Pokemon Scarlet and Violet definitely like knock it out of the park and do everything clearly much better than Pokemon Sword and Shield, are clearly more polished, have a better open world, have better mechanics and everything like more thought out, and an interesting story or stories, as we do have in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, 3 stories. If that is all like really good, then that will of course affect how people view Pokemon Sword and Shield in the future. But I do think Pokemon Sword and Shield will be seen as they were just maybe kind of good. Maybe some people will think about this whole generation as kind of an awkward phase between Scarlet and Violet and Sun and Moon. But I don't think people will see it as kind of like the beginning of the end. Some people, of course, individuals will to think of that, but a lot of people play Pokemon. The Pokemon fandom is so varied. A lot of people have different opinions, and every Pokemon game is kind of made unique. So, of course, people tend to like a varied amount of Pokemon games. Some people like this game more than that game, and some people like that game more than this game, and that's just completely fine. But yeah, I think that will be Sword and Shield Legacy, kind of a generation. But what do you think? Do you really love Pokemon Sword and Shield? Or do you, after all this time, really despise it still for some reason? Let me know down in the comments below. Also subscribe, also like, and also send me some cool love letters. I like receiving them. Anyway, I have rambled on way too much already, so I will just see you guys next time. Bye bye.